Camp Security, a Revolutionary War prison camp, Springettsbury Township, York, Pennsylvania. A collaborative, historical effort by the Friends of Camp Security. Camp Security is the last remaining undeveloped prisoner of war camp from the Revolutionary War, one of only a handful to ever be established. It is located just east of the city of York in Springettsbury Township. Camp Security housed over 1,000 British and Canadian prisoners of war between the summer of 1781 and the spring of 1783. It all began at Saratoga, New York. The American troops decisively defeated the British at Saratoga. Approximately 6,000 British were forced to surrender. The surrender of General John Burgoyne to General Gates at Saratoga, New York, on October 18, 1777, placed the British, Hessian, and Canadian prisoners of war in the hands of the Continental Congress, then in session at York, Pennsylvania. An official report states that 5,800 troops surrendered at Saratoga, of which there were 2,400 Hessians. According to the terms of their surrender, written in a document entitled the Convention of Saratoga, the prisoners were to be marched to Boston and shipped back to Great Britain. Congress, wanting to ensure that none of the officers returned to the battlefield, asked that General Burgoyne write a descriptive list of each of the officers under his command. This request was not specified in the Convention of Saratoga, and General Burgoyne became personally offended and refused to heed the request. On the 8th of January, 1778, Congress resolved to suspend the terms of the Convention of Saratoga and kept the prisoners in custody. After remaining in the Boston area for the winter, the decision was made to relocate the prisoners to Charlottesville, Virginia, where they could be more closely watched and better supplied. In November 1778, the prisoners marched southward. Many of the British soldiers had their wives and children with them, and wagons were provided for their transportation, but the men had to march on foot. 2 years later, as the war moved closer to Virginia, the decision was made to once again move the prisoners. Their next destination was Pennsylvania. Some of them ultimately were sent to York County. Pennsylvania's president, Joseph Reed, wrote to Lieutenant William Scott of the York County Militia to find a suitable spot to construct a prisoner of war camp. President Reed instructed that it should be well watered and well wooded, a place where huts could be built, surrounded by a picket. In the summer of 1781, a stockade and living quarters were built on the 280-acre farm appropriated for the camp. Sources estimate that the size of the area of Camp Security was between 20 and 40 acres. This is the Schultz House, the farmhouse still standing at the Camp Security site. On August 2nd, 1781, Colonel James Wood stated, "I have fixed the British troops on good ground, the property of a non-juror, between York and the Susquehanna, so as to be convenient to throw them across the river in any emergency." He approved the site that was selected by York County's militia officials. The place selected as a cantonment for the prisoners was situated in what is now the extreme southeastern portion of Springettsbury Township, and the stockade is estimated to have covered a 2 to 3 acre area. The British Convention prisoners, numbering about 1,000, were brought from Lancaster in August of 1781. Some were reportedly required to assist in erecting the stockade of logs and building huts. This place became known in the Revolutionary annals as Camp Security. The stockade may have been constructed similarly to this one at Fort Ligonier. Early in 1782, Burgoyne's men were joined by troops from the Cornwallis Army that were recently captured at Yorktown. Only privates and non-commissioned officers from both armies were held at Camp Security. Period memoirs indicate some members of the Convention Army, first housed in the stockade, were permitted to live in a nearby village of huts. This village of huts outside the stockade became known as Camp Indulgence. Cornwallis's troops, considered a greater escape risk, were imprisoned in the stockade. British prisoners recalled that Camp Indulgence was located on higher ground. A hut may have been of similar construction to this one at Valley Forge. For much of the existence of the camp, the Guard was made up of York County militia units. The typical length of militia service in Pennsylvania was 2 months. Wives and children accompanied many of the prisoners, a common practice at that time. The camp, perhaps, even housed a few Americans, as some convention prisoners may have married former colonists during their 7 years in captivity. A fever reportedly hit the camp, killing many prisoners and family members who were buried near the camp. By the end of 1781, it appears that many of Burgoyne's troops had accepted their confinement. They were also permitted to establish cottage industries, such as making lace, buckles, spoons, pins, and other items. If they were considered trustworthy, the prisoners were allowed passes to travel outside the camp to work and to sell items to the local residents in Yorktown. A pass system allowed some prisoners to work for local residents, thereby supplementing the camp's meager supply of food, clothing, and blankets. Because of one of those British prisoners, much has been learned about the camp. Sergeant Roger Lamb, an educated Irishman who was captured with Burgoyne at Saratoga, later wrote a work entitled Journal of Occurrences During the Late American War, which was published in Dublin in 1809. Roger Lamb, a Welsh Fusilier, was a prisoner at Camp Security. Much of what we know about Camp Security came from Roger Lamb's memoir. Sergeant Lamb was able to escape with 7 companions. He went to New York City and joined the troops commanded by Sir Guy Charlton. After the war, Lamb was able to return to Dublin, where he became a teacher and an author, and died in 1830. The account of Sergeant Lamb is valuable in depicting the conditions of the camp and in describing the mental state of the Burgoyne prisoners. By then, after years of confinement, many of Burgoyne's troops had given up any desire to escape. They were being reasonably well treated in America and were able to raise families in Camp Indulgence. The prisoners held at Camp Security until the preliminary peace treaty was signed in April 1783. The signing of the Treaty of Paris in September 1783 formally ended the Revolutionary War. The land was returned to its rightful owner after the war, and the encampment slowly deteriorated. Over the years, the huts and stockades were disassembled and the logs used for firewood, railing, or other construction. Local farmers used the posts of the pickets for fencing. It is possible that elements of the camp remain embedded in the fabric of some of the early houses in the York area. George R. Prowell, stating in 1907, writes, "This historic spot, though very rugged, has been farmed over, so that unless that it is marked, the exact site will be known to future generations only by tradition." 160 acres of that site that housed the camp for over 1,000 British prisoners from 1781 to 1783 has been preserved through funding from state, county, and local governments, a national environmental fund, private foundations, and many individuals. The land has been transferred to Springettsbury Township for perpetual safekeeping. Through our archaeological research, we are trying to find those missing pieces of evidence that help us locate the footprint of the stockade. In 1979, a dig was done in one of the fields on the site. Thousands of different artifacts were found, including items such as buttons, cufflinks, and straight pins. These artifacts were also the same kind of objects prisoners of Camp Indulgence used or made. When the dig was completed, there was no sign of a stockade. Camp Indulgence was not surrounded by a stockade. British prisoners recalled that Camp Indulgence was located on higher ground. The dig site was on a field that was higher in elevation than the other fields. For these reasons, it is believed that the 1979 dig site was where the Camp Indulgence section of the camp once stood. In 2014, 2015, and 2016, we continued our archaeological research. We have found various kinds of buttons, musket balls, coins, and a sizable amount of redware shards. We have found English gunflint and hand-wrought nails. Although we didn't find evidence of a stockade, we did find prehistoric artifacts. During the 2016 season, we found the most 18th century artifacts of all 3 seasons. Despite of the artifacts we have found, there is still no evidence of a stockade trench. Remote sensing has been utilized to help provide more answers. Camp Security was an American Revolutionary War prison camp built in 1781 and existed until 1783. As our search for the stockade continues, the goal of the Friends of Camp Security is to preserve, interpret, and commemorate the Camp Security site.